How should we answer the love of God? This question lies at the heart of today's gospel reading. This passage from Matthew 22 begins with silence. You have the Sadducees, one of the groups of religious leaders in Jesus' day, who had asked Jesus a question about marriage and resurrection, and his answer silenced them. They had nothing to say in return. Now the Pharisees, another group of religious leaders, have gathered together, and one of them, who is an expert in the law, asks a question to test Jesus. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus responds with the words that are so familiar that maybe several of us here today have them committed to memory because you have heard them and said them so often. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. To Jesus' contemporaries, this was not a new or radical claim to make. It was a biblical interpretation that had broad agreement among the religious scholars of Jesus' day. The first commandment that he references is the second part of the Shema from Deuteronomy 6:4-5, this daily prayer of the ancient Israelites that begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And the second commandment that Jesus references, to love your neighbor as yourself, is a direct quote from Leviticus 19:18. Jesus is saying that the Torah is rightly understood and interpreted when it's viewed through the lens of love for God and love for neighbor. And most of his contemporaries probably would have agreed with this interpretation. But this is not just a friendly conversation about biblical interpretation among a group of peers. There's more going on here. Jesus has entered Jerusalem for the final time before his death. This conversation takes place the Tuesday of Holy Week. Jesus has entered Jerusalem triumphantly, greeted by crowds who are laying down cloaks and palm branches on the road in front of him. He's cleansed the temple. He's had his authority questioned by the chief priests and the elders, and now he's in the temple engaged in a series of disputes with the religious leaders. Matthew's gospel tells us that the religious leaders want Jesus dead, but they're afraid of the crowds. Perhaps they're disappointed with Jesus' answer about the greatest commandment because they've been hoping that he would have responded with something that's outside of their understanding of the Torah, but he doesn't. They can't find any fault in his answer because it's probably the answer that they themselves would have given. What Jesus does, though, is that he turns the questioning around back on them. And then what follows this discussion of the greatest commandment is a discussion about the identity of the Messiah. Jesus asks the Pharisees whose son the Messiah is. They say David's. And then he cites Psalm 110, and he asks them, how is it that David could call his own son Lord, when this Lord is clearly elevated to a place of vindication before his enemies? In other words, how could David's descendant also be his Lord, one who is greater than David himself? This is a strange segue, isn't it? To go from a discussion of the greatest commandment to the identity of the Messiah. But we know what the religious leaders do not know, that their long-awaited Messiah is standing right in front of them. Not only is he the son of David, he is Lord. He reminds them of the greatest commandments, to love God and to love neighbor, and then he speaks about the identity of the Messiah himself. He should be the very object of their love and worship, God in the flesh. But like the Sadducees, their response to him is silence because they aren't able to see him for who he is. This is what verse 46 says. No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. The religious leaders will continue to spar with Jesus in the temple, but on Wednesday, some of them, the Sanhedrin, will plot to kill him. Because this passage is such a familiar one for so many of us, it can be difficult to view Jesus' words with fresh eyes. Love God, love each other. Check. But what's radical about this call to obey the two greatest commandments isn't that it's anything new. It wasn't new for Jesus' contemporaries, and it isn't new for us. This is not a new idea. What's radical about it is that when we take it seriously, it requires something of us. It's a discipleship that is costly. And we do it as a response. It's not our initiative. God reaches out to us in love, and we answer back with love. This morning, I want to reflect on two aspects of this call to love God and neighbor, two truths that we can glean from the gospel reading. First, to love others is to recognize and honor the image of God in them. Do you remember the gospel reading from last Sunday? It was a scene in this extended conversation between Jesus and the religious leaders in the temple. The Pharisees have asked Jesus if it's lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not. And they do this because they want to know what side he's on. Is he on Rome's side or the people's side? So Jesus asks them to get a coin. They do. And then he asks whose image is on the coin? The emperor's. And Jesus concludes, "Give therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." What's so subversive about this answer of Jesus is that, of course, Caesar can stamp his image on a coin and claim taxes from his subjects. He's the emperor, he can do that. But God's image is imprinted on creation itself. The Imago Dei is the gift that God has bestowed upon humanity. To give to God what is God's is to recognize the image of God in others. It's to see the divine image of God in every single person we encounter. This is what Michael Anthony Howard writes about this. Giving to God what is God's, loving our neighbor as ourselves, is a peculiar kind of politics. It is God's tool to remake the world. It requires of us to expect to find God's image in our neighbors and in our enemies. Every single person around us bears the image of God. That includes the person sitting on your left and your right here in the sanctuary. It includes the cashier at Wegmans scanning your groceries. It includes the unhoused person standing on the corner at the stoplight when you're there in your car. It even includes you. When we see the image of God in the people around us, when we honor their sacred worth, it becomes much more difficult to otherize them. It becomes harder to believe the lie that their lives matter less than ours, that their pain or their marginalization is justified. When we look at them and see the image of God, the fingerprints of the Creator, we will act toward them accordingly. They have been created by God. God delights in them, and God's mercy and faithfulness is theirs to claim. And because loving our neighbor and loving God's are two sides of the same coin, not the same thing exactly, but two things which cannot be separated. When we love our neighbors, when we recognize and honor the image of God in them, this is an act of worship. It is our affirmation that God, in God's infinite power and goodness, has fashioned a creation that is worthy of our care and attention. It is our belief that God's very nature is love because God has bestowed us with God's image. And when that image was marred by sin, God reconciled us to God's self through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are relational creatures. When we are in right relationship with others, rightly seeing them as God has made them to be, honoring their sacred worth, it helps us to be in right relationship with God, to rightly see God for who God is, to understand that God is love, and to respond to God in turn with love, like a child who hears their parents say with delight, "I love you," and responding back, "I love you too." Second, to love others is to model the steadfast love of God. The love that is referenced in Deuteronomy 6:5, the first greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This is a particular kind of love. It's not talking about an emotion or a feeling. It's about action. It's about living out loyalty and faithfulness. Israel was called to covenantal faithfulness to Yahweh, and this covenantal faithfulness was modeled by God. They were called to be people of steadfast love because they worshiped the God of steadfast love. If we want to know the nature of this love to which we are called, love of God and love of neighbor, all we have to do is look to Christ. He is our model. We look to his ministry, his healing and compassion for the sick and suffering, his decision to eat with sinners and social outcasts. We look to his teaching about the kingdom of God, that we are called to be merciful as God is merciful and to love our enemies. And we look to his death. This is what we are fast approaching as we are here with him in the temple just a few days before his arrest. He will be crucified and will be raised from the dead on the third day so that sin and death will be defeated. The love of God is cruciform. This is the love God has shown us. This is covenantal faithfulness. And this is the love to which we are called. When we choose to follow Jesus to the cross and to love others in the way that he has modeled for us, this is our act of worship. This is our affirmation that the one who stands before us is the Messiah, the Son of David, the Lord. He has come to bring healing and liberation not only to his people, but to all of creation. This love of God and love of our neighbor becomes even more fused when we look at Jesus' words just a few chapters later in Matthew 25. Jesus is describing the judgment that will accompany the coming of the Son of Man, the separating of the sheep and the goats. And this is what he says: "Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.'" This is what the love of God and love of neighbor looks like in practice. What we have done to the least of these, we have done to Christ. To love our neighbor is to love Christ himself. You cannot separate these things. Love is the logic of the law. It is the very thing which gives sense and meaning to the law. And this is why the Apostle Paul says, "If I speak in the tongues of humans and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing." There is no righteousness without love. This morning, I want us to consider together, how might God be calling us to grow in love? As individuals, yes, but also together as a church. As many of you know, we are preparing to enter a season of change at COS. Starting in Advent, we'll be adding a second Sunday morning worship service because we are running out of room in the sanctuary. What a wonderful problem to have. And I know that in the grand scheme of things, adding a second service is not a big change, but we will all be disrupted. There is discomfort in that. There is loss. It's a kind of loss. How can we love each other well as we process this change and as we prepare for it? How can we love the people who have yet to come? Those who will visit and perhaps make COS their church home in the following weeks and months. How will we make space for them physically in our sanctuary as we worship together? And how will we make space for them at the table of the Lord? How can we love our neighbors well? Not just our neighbors who live close to our own homes, but our neighbors here around COS. Our neighbors who live in the houses on Fort Hill Terrace, on Westview Terrace, on Rosemont. Our neighbors at the Rochester Psych Center and at Strong Memorial Hospital and at the University of Rochester. Our neighbors in College Town and at the bus stop. And how can we love those among us who are navigating seasons of illness or grief or financial need? What does that look like to bear each other's burdens? How might God be inviting us into new ways of deepening our love for God and for God's image bearers? I recently came across a beautiful quote by St. John Chrysostom, one of the church fathers of the 4th century. It's an excerpt from one of his homilies, and it's quoted in the book that the Wednesday Women's Study Group is currently reading. It's a lovely book. It's called Lost in Wonder. And this is what John Chrysostom writes about love. Just as what brings heat makes things expand, so it is the gift of love, to stretch hearts wide open. It is a warm and glowing virtue. This is the beauty and the mystery of love. It is not a finite resource. It's not something that we can run out of or that we need to hoard. We could spend our whole lives and never begin to plumb the depths of God's love for us. This is the love we receive. This is the love we are called to reflect. How should we answer the love of God? With hearts that stretch wide open as we grow in the perfect love of Christ. Amen.